Sometimes the human heart opening is a doorway to the spiritual heart, for sure. Very, very often. Often it comes when you reach the limitation of the human heart. Like you reach the limitation, you reach the place where your human heart, it just doesn't know what to do. It can't do it, right? It can't open, it can't change itself, it can't transform itself. It hits a sort of wall of limitation. And when we get to these kind of walls of limitation, what feels like something that's impenetrable, that's where the teaching of surrender really becomes really important, because otherwise we'll just get to these sort of seemingly impenetrable places in our psyche, and either we'll just keep going back and keep trying to find the right technique to do it with, and once we've got to the edge, it's not like a technique is going to do it, or we start making lots of negative interpretations, right, about, oh, I guess I'm not worthy, or whatever the negative sort of story that can get ensued. But surrender is a teaching that is really most applicable whenever we run up against what feels like an impenetrable limitation, where we just don't know what we can do. My first access to the spiritual heart came about through a moment of just utter failure, reaching limitation completely, and realizing that I couldn't actually make a breakthrough happen. It was also had to do with a sort of disappointment, a kind of sense of failing, like all this kind of coming together at one moment, and this strange paradox of finally being able to sort of take all that in. Not that I wasn't experiencing it, but really almost being able to breathe the reality of all these limitations or failures and breathe them in without all the accompanying storylines, but just the raw, visceral sort of disappointment of it all. And as well as an acknowledgement, a very profound acknowledgement that I didn't really know what to do, and I knew it just felt like I could never know what to do. And so in a certain sense, it was almost like a very heartfelt confession to the universe, right? Just boom, I hit my limitation. Almost like, like when you hear people that are alcoholics or drug addicts and they talk about bottoming out, there's all forms of bottoming out. Some of them have to do with substances, some of them are to do with just sort of more emotional states, and you just hit the ground, hit the bottom level. And part of that is at that deep well of disappointment, of recognizing what you can do and what you can't do, with the emphasis on what you can't do, right? That's a big part of surrendering. And in the modern world, we tend to approach things like surrender, as I said, way too technically. Like there's going to be a 5-point surrender plan. Well, if there was, everybody would be doing it, wouldn't they? But it doesn't work that way. It's how deeply do you let yourself experience your own vulnerable limitedness as a human being? And I mean, without another corresponding story of how terrible you are, because that's still not surrendering, because that has to be surrendered too. So yes, the human heart can be a profound portal to the spiritual heart. And a lot of that has to do with surrendering. recognizing what's sort of beyond us as a human being, that something else will have to, in essence, sort of do it for us. That's one way of thinking about it. And that takes a kind of integrity, a kind of honesty, right? It takes a kind of honesty. And yet many people are willing to be honest when the honesty is like good news or empowering news. But when it feels disempowering and it's not good news, then we're less inclined to be honest. That's why so often, we have to kind of bottom out, because bottoming out is getting completely and absolutely real and completely and absolutely viscerally honest, like stripped of it all, even stripped of our story about bottoming out, of whether we're good or bad or indifferent, just being, that's the real surrender. So in that sense, surrender has been and will continue to be the most powerful access point to the spiritual heart. The spiritual heart is revealed in surrender. Now, not all surrender needs to be a bottoming out experience. I hope you don't come away with that conclusion. I'm not saying that it has to go that route. Sometimes it does, maybe often it does, but it doesn't have to be. We can just sort of let go in a way. But part of letting go is the limit. Is becoming really aware of all the ways we protect ourselves from real surrender. All the ways we try to ensure that it never really happens. To recognize that is also an intimate part of surrender, of letting go, right? So sometimes, the spiritual heart just opens up without getting your act together emotionally. But the human heart really does need to, at some point, in some manner, surrender, like consent its limitation. That's what connects it to the bigger boundless heart. And so, even though one doesn't have to get their whole emotional act together in order to connect with the deeper spiritual heart, you don't have to do that. Like surrendering isn't getting your act together, right? It's not healing all of your emotional wounds. It's surrender, which is something different. But having the human heart become more coherent and less conflicted, and to have it find its own healing, that's certainly vital when it comes to really embodying experiences of the spiritual heart, for sure. Because we can have this spiritual, real deep experiences of unity and oneness, and find those very difficult to embody in our humanity. And most of the reason that those become difficult to embody in our humanity is because we can have a lot of unresolved emotional conflict that make it very hard for that realization or revelation to kind of really become quite literally, not just figuratively, but quite literally embodied. I think people often don't understand that when I use the word embodied, I'm using it figuratively, but I'm also using it quite literally. There is a real literal sort of embodiment. So how we go about that emotional healing work is different from person to person. Some people can do it through various contemplative, methodologies. I've talked a lot about that at certain times in my teaching work. Whether you have to, some people find they're really well served by a really good therapy. trauma work. There's all sorts of different ways that we can bring more coherence to the conflicts within the human heart. Do we have to have all that done to realize a spiritual heart? No. But do we have to have a certain level of coherence in order to really embody those realizations? Yeah. Doesn't mean you have to be, an emotional saint. Thank goodness. But some coherency is vital. It really, 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 really helps. So